me as possible over Zoom. So thank you very much indeed to the university for this invitation. This evening, I'd like to talk about what we are trying to do in Oxford to tell the story of ancient Mesopotamia, but also to think about how that ancient story can tell us about more recent history. I'll start with this image, which is of one of the Oxford colleges. This is Oriel College, part of the University of Oxford, and this has become famous in the country, in the United Kingdom, because of a statue. The statue you can see in the centre of the building. This is a statue of Cecil Rhodes. He was a British empire builder and conquered and ruled a large part of Africa in the 19th century. There has been a huge debate in Oxford about whether this statue should stay on this building. And it has made everybody think about their colonial past. What did the British Empire do in terms of its history? It has made the Ashmolean Museum think about its own history and how so much of that was created as a result of the British Empire. And what that means in terms of our history and our relations with Iraq, and how we tell Iraq's ancient past. So here, the Ashmolean Museum, my museum, was opened to the public in 1683, so over 300 years ago. And at that time, the collection contained nothing from Mesopotamia. The first object from Iraq to enter the Ashmoleans' collection came from excavations at Nimrud in northern Iraq by the British archaeologist Henry Layard. This was in 1850. He dug up a lot of the objects from Nimrud, but he was working for the British Museum. This was a colonial exercise. It was part of the British Empire and an attempt by the British Empire to claim ownership over all the past. And so large numbers of Assyrian reliefs were removed from Nimrud and taken to the National Museum in London, the British Museum. It was a symbol of British control and power. And the British wanted to control the past as much as the present. So although most of the Assyrian reliefs went to the British Museum, Henry Layard gave one or two of the reliefs to friends and other institutions. And because the University of Oxford had given Henry Layard a degree, Henry Layard gave Oxford an Assyrian relief. This is the Assyrian relief from Nimrud, which is now in the Ashmolean Museum. It arrived in Oxford in 1852 and was the first and only object from Iraq in Oxford at that time. It would take another 50 years before more objects came to Oxford from Iraq. Until that time, the Ashmoleans' collections had only objects from Western Europe. So classical sculptures, Greek and Roman, as well as objects from Europe. Paintings, drawings, sculptures, art, but nothing outside of Europe. The only other objects which were in the Ashmolean, which were not from Europe, came from Egypt. And so the Ashmolean Museum was a museum just of Western civilization and those areas of the world which at that time was thought to be connected with the West, particularly through the Bible. And so objects from Egypt were brought to Oxford to join the collection of Western civilization. No other part of the world was represented. And then that changed with the expansion of the British Empire. A story that will be, I'm sure, familiar to you all. The invasion and occupation of southern Iraq by the British Army as they campaigned against the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which controlled Mesopotamia. So here you can see on the left-hand side a photograph of the commanding officer of the British forces, General Stanley Maude, entering Baghdad in 1917. And with that invasion and occupation, Britain could take control over the heritage of the country. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see British Army officers visiting Babylon in 1918. Babylon had been excavated by German archaeologists. Germany, of course, were on the other side in the war, and so Britain could now take ownership of this past. And we see British Army officers visiting Babylon as tourists. It was part of a claim by Britain over antiquity. And as a result, objects from Mesopotamia, from Iraq's ancient past, started to arrive at the Ashmolean. It could join with Western civilization, Egypt, and now be part of that story, the origins of the West as it was thought at that time. Of course, British occupation of Mesopotamia resulted in the establishment of the Kingdom of Iraq. And here you see an Ottoman stamp overprinted with the words British occupation in 1921. So there was a real sense of Britain taking control through the Kingdom of Iraq. And the past was very important in that story. You will, I'm sure, know the name Gertrude Bell, appointed by King Faisal I as Honorary Director of Antiquities in Baghdad. This is a photograph of Gertrude Bell and instructions on how to reach her. You could send a telegram to her by simply sending it to Antiquity, Baghdad. She would take control over the antiquities of the new kingdom, deciding what would go into a new museum in Baghdad, and would write the laws that would allow foreign excavations to remove objects from the country. As a result of these new laws, large excavations by foreign archaeologists began to dig enormous holes in the ground in Iraq. The two biggest excavations were those at Ur, by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, and a very large excavation at the site of Kish, which was by the University of Oxford and the Field Museum in Chicago. And as a result of these big excavations, thousands of objects from Kish entered the Ashmolean Museum. They told a story of the origins of the world's first cities. They told a story of the world's first palace and king in Iraq. They told the story of the world's first empire. And they told that story over 3,000 years, from around 3000 BC to the coming of Islam and beyond. So it was a very important excavation for telling the story of Iraq's ancient past. Thousands of objects were excavated, and they were divided between the excavators and the New Iraq Museum. In this image, you can see large numbers of pots being sorted at Ur. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see Gertrude Bell herself deciding which objects should stay in Iraq and which objects should leave, which objects should be exported abroad. The result was that the excavations at Kish were divided between the Antiquities Museum in Baghdad, which Bell had established, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and the Field Museum in Chicago. So the story of this site, a really important site in Iraq, and Iraq's history was split between different centers around the world. And this was precisely because Britain had the power to do this. It was part of the British Empire, the legacy of colonialism. Not only objects from Kish came to Oxford at this time, but many hundreds of cuneiform records. The ancient documents of Mesopotamia were being dug up at many sites across southern Iraq, and they too were being taken out of the country. Some of them were certainly smuggled out, and some were being looted from sites rather than being excavated. In the Ashmolean, we have some 5,000 cuneiform records from Iraq. This is one of the most famous examples, the Sumerian king list. It lists all the rulers of the cities, some of the cities of ancient Sumer, back in time to the beginning of time. A very important and interesting document, but we really don't know where it was discovered. It was probably looted from the site of Lhasa, but we can't be certain because, of course, it was bought by somebody in Baghdad who then gave it to the Ashmolean. By 1932, excavations in Iraq had filled the Ashmolean with objects from ancient Mesopotamia. So now the Ashmolean could represent Western civilization and what was thought to be its roots in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And that story continued to be developed as a result of the establishment of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq. This was established in 1932, the very year that Iraq got its independence from the British Empire. And it was a way of maintaining British interests in the archaeology of the country and to ensure that objects from excavations continue to leave. The major excavations by the British School took place at Nimrud, that very site that Henry Layard had excavated 100 years before. And the excavations at Nimrud allowed for large numbers of objects to be divided between the excavators and international museums. Some of the most famous objects are the so-called Nimrud ivories, which are now divided between Baghdad, New York, London, and Oxford. The division of finds, the division of discoveries was a standard practice right up until the 1960s. In the Ashmolean, these objects were displayed in a very traditional manner. Here you can see the ancient Near East gallery in the Ashmolean Museum, which existed between 1960 and 2005. And the way in which these objects were shown to the public was very typical of museums everywhere, both in the United Kingdom and also in Iraq. In Iraq, the story of the nation, the story of the country's past, was in the Iraq Museum. But in the Ashmolean, Iraq's story was told alongside the story of neighboring countries. And here you can see the story of Iraq is colored blue. So all the objects from Kish and Nimrud are in these cases. And then alongside them, in different colors, are objects from Iran, Turkey, and other places across the Middle East. This is a plan of that gallery, showing the way in which the organization of the collection was made. Palestine, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, all as separate places, and the objects shown on shelves with lots of information. Here are some examples of the type of labels found in the gallery. These are long essays, and it would have taken a student a long time to read them. Very difficult to understand, lots of information, and doesn't really explain the story of Iraq or its relationships to neighboring regions. In 2009, however, a new ancient Near East gallery was opened at the Ashmolean. So 10 years ago, an attempt was made to rethink how to tell those stories. So here you can see photographs of the current Ashmolean Museum Ancient Near East Gallery. But in many ways, the same ideas as in the earlier gallery was kept. Here is the layout of the Ancient Near East Gallery. And again, I hope you can see from this plan the way in which material is divided between different areas of the so-called Middle East, as well as some displays that look at things like writing and farming. But otherwise, Mesopotamia has its own section in the center of the gallery, and then parts of the collection is divided: Nimrud, Babylon, Assyria, around the edges. It is a very complex picture, and to try and tell Iraq's story in this very complex way, particularly, especially for visitors who have very little knowledge of the region, it is extremely difficult. We decided, therefore, to try and introduce into the Near East Gallery new ways of telling stories. These ideas have been developed at a number of museums around the world, including Iraq, where some very exciting work is going on in many of the museums across the country. The idea is to tell stories through the objects and introduce sound and smell and moving images, film and video, to try and bring the stories to life. So not just pots on a shelf, but ideas about people and their lives. In this way, we hope that we can make visitors to the museum understand the objects that they are looking at were part of people's story, and by understanding them, they will come to value them. By valuing them, they will want to care for them, and by caring for them, they will get enjoyment, and so on, in what has been described as a heritage cycle. And this applies not just to museums, but to heritage sites. Places like Ur, the great ziggurat of Ur in the center of the slide, can really be only cared for by people who enjoy and understand and then value it, and so on. And this is the work that museums should be making, ensuring people understand the past so they value it, to care for it and enjoy it. So the idea of the layout of the Ashmoleans' ancient Near East Gallery, we think, need to be changed. And this is going to be the layout of the new gallery, which we plan to open next year. Now the story will be told not through different regions of the Middle East, separated from each other, but through ideas and from the early farming communities of the Middle East, through the emergence of first cities, the emergence of kings, the emergence of schools and writing, and the development of great empires, the focus here on the Assyrian Empire. So you can travel through the story of Iraq from one end of the gallery to the other, through the experiences, the voices and ideas of people, not just objects. I will give you a few examples of what we are hoping to achieve. One of the most important areas of the new gallery will be devoted to the story of how the objects came to the Ashmolean. This will explain to visitors from Oxford, from around the United Kingdom, as well as our visitors from abroad, how the objects were part of the story of the British Empire, and how it was through claiming the past that these objects came to the Ashmolean. But in fact, how they are very much part of Iraq's past, emphasizing the colonial legacy and how we might address it. And that includes the question of restoration, restoring or restitution, restoring objects to Iraq, part of a wider debate around what objects in foreign collections are about. And as part of that story, we will remind visitors of the expedition to Kish in the 1920s through film such as this. Here you can see a film taken at Kish in 1927 by the British archaeologists, recording the workers who did the digging. And they are, of course, Iraqis. They were employed to dig the large holes in the ground, but it is on the basis of the foreign colonial powers' control over the country. And it is through moving film and through sound, as we will see in a moment, that we hope to make this story alive and meaningful to people. Another area that we want to focus on is the idea of the world's first cities and how kings emerged in ancient Iraq, in Mesopotamia. And so in a series of cases along this wall, we will lay out the objects so that they tell the story of that development, as if you were reading a book. So the labels will tell that story of the objects. And we can show how from Susa in Iran and Tel Brak in Syria, the world's first cities emerged and then developed in Sumer, where writing emerged and kingship. So an interconnected world, just as it is today, through objects and the voices of the ancient people, captured in writing. So this is now being imagined as a story that a visitor can follow, not just objects on a shelf, but rather part of living experiences. Another area which brings those living experiences, we hope, to life is in a section devoted to schools and scholars. This is a case which will explain the extraordinary development of writing and the world's first schools in places like Nippur and Uruk and Ur. And to do that, we will show some of our cuneiform tablets. This, for example, is an account of the famous epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous story to have come from Iraq. And we have, as part of the display, the opportunity for people to listen to ancient Sumerian. The idea will be to have subtitles in English and Arabic, again emphasizing that relationship between ancient Iraq and modern Iraq through storytelling. And this is one of the big changes that is happening in museums around the world. Creating galleries which will invite people from around the world to experience the past through narrative, through stories. It's something, of course, that is found all around the world and which everybody can engage with. And as a result, we hope that we can make museums a place where communities can come together to share the lived experiences, those that are greater than any differences we see or imagine. And through that process, connect ancient Iraq to modern Iraq and the stories of how Iraq was established through the colonial experience and the legacy of that age. Thank you very much for listening to this introduction to some of the ideas we are hoping to do at the Ashmolean. It is something that we can only do through the collaboration and friendship of the people of Iraq. And I am extremely grateful to all my colleagues for their contribution in making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. We appreciate your efforts, everything clear. I would like to meet in Baghdad after this coronavirus pandemic. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you very much indeed. Good night. My pleasure.
Goodbye.